Welcome to the Martinus Cosmology podcast. Our podcasts are dedicated to reflections on life, seen from the perspective of the Danish writer Martinus. My name is Pernilla Rosell, and at the moment I'm sitting in Stockholm the day before Christmas Eve. That is on the 23rd of December, with snow falling outside. It's winter and cold as usual, and I'm calling Mary McGovern, who is in Copenhagen. Hello, Mary.
Hello.
Nice to see you. We are recording this podcast over Skype, as you understand, and we hope that everything will work. So what about you? Do you have snow in Copenhagen as well?
Yes, we've woken up to a covering of snow today, so it looks like we'll have a white Christmas here.
And so will we, which is not always the case. But since it is Christmas, we would like to reflect a little on Christmas time. And I should also say that you, Mary, you don't really need an introduction. We have recorded several podcasts together, but just for possible newcomers, I could tell that Mary McGovern is working at the Martinus Institute in Copenhagen as a teacher and as a translator.
Yes.
And for many years you have been the main translator of Martinus's works into English. And as we know, he wrote his main work, The Book of Life, or Livets Bog, as it's called in Danish, and The Eternal World Picture with all the symbols, and other books. But he also wrote a great number of articles and Christmas letters as well, that were usually published in his magazine Kosmos. So we'll come back to that. But 1 year ago, you, Mary, recorded a podcast together with Tryggve Gudmundsson, an Icelandic lecturer in Martinus's cosmology, and then you talked about the symbolic meaning of the Christmas gospel according to Martinus.
Yes.
And we're not going to repeat all that you said and everything that Martinus has written about Christmas, but according to Martinus, Christmas was actually a very important event to mankind, and it is an important event to mankind even today. So perhaps you could summarize briefly, what did Martinus write about the Christmas gospel?
Well, he wrote a lot about Christmas, and some people think that that's rather strange because maybe they associate Christmas with commercialism and the shops selling lots of things. But for Martinus, it's a cosmic principle. There's so many aspects to it, so it's hard to know where to start. But if we think of the winter season, if we think of the four seasons of the year, we can see that we have just passed the winter solstice, the 21st of December, where darkness culminates. And today we're celebrating that the day is just over a minute longer than it was 2 days ago. So in this northern part of the world. So, and if you live in this part of the world, you're absolutely longing for longer days when you get to this point. But Martinus likens our mental situation to this winter solstice, that we're in a very dark place in the world on many levels, although there are many light impulses too. So if we just look around at the political situation, we see a lot of war and unrest and dictatorship and discord and political fighting and infighting and economic problems and refugee problems and so on. There's an awful lot of dark things that could be symbolized by this winter solstice. But Martinus shows that the principle of Christmas is that light returns. So he says that the Christmas principle, in a way, is the principle of world redemption. He has a symbol called the principle of world redemption. It's number 2, which we can link to on the Martinus Institute's homepage, which looks like a Christmas tree with a star on the top and all these stages of mankind. And we can see that through mankind's history, then various spiritual teachers have incarnated to guide us towards the light. So he mentions Buddha, Muhammad, Christ, and various others. So Christmas is really about the incarnation of light in the darkness. It's this turning point. It's this moral turning point symbolized by this dark point of the seasons.
Exactly. And I think it's also so moving and interesting and inspiring at the same time when he tells us that that the birth of the Christ child that we read about in the Christmas story, that's more like a story that I loved to read when I was a child. But he says that this is really the birth of the Christ child, or the humane being within each of us.
Yeah, and actually the birth of the Christ child within us has many ramifications. It's the birth of humaneness within us, and the darkness has become an automatic part of our personality, really. In order to experience life eternally, which we do according to Martinus, then we have to experience the culmination of darkness and the culmination of light. And we're at a stage where we have become absolute geniuses at creating darkness. And you just have to look around the world or just see the news to see that this is true, that we're really, really good at giving each other problems. But many of us are so satiated with the consequences of our dark actions that we're longing for something else. And this stimulates us partly to improve our own behavior and partly to seek inspiration to improve our behavior and see what it is we can do in order to be happier. And put very briefly, then if we want to be happy, then we have to make others happy. We have to be good and kind and loving and do all we can to make life more pleasant for our neighbours. And this is really the Christ principle.
And it's also what we try to practice on Christmas Day, and what Martinus says that we will be able to practice every day, which means that every day will be like Christmas Day in the future.
Yes, he talks about the principle of giving. Like we're in a culture at the moment that's very much governed by the principle of taking, like your money or your life kind of epoch. But he says that we're moving towards an epoch of giving. And we see this manifested at Christmas, if only for 24 hours, or in the days up to Christmas, people are very focused on giving. I was in the metro here in Copenhagen the other day, and it was rather interesting to sit there and hear people talking about, oh, what shall I give him, and what shall I give her, and we have to buy this for him, and so on. And so, well, they're all focused on giving. And that was rather nice.
Yeah. Perhaps that is also why he, among other things, really came back to this topic every Christmas. He also gave Christmas lectures and talks and wrote articles about Christmas. If we'll just start looking at his Christmas letters, I always enjoy reading them and rereading them because they're also quite personal. You can really feel the moment when they were written, and they still contain a lot of information and deep reflection, and also beautiful passages of poetry, I would say, about light and darkness, which we find everywhere in his writings. So perhaps you could tell us a little about the historical background of these Christmas letters. When did he start writing them, and why was it so important to him, do you think?
Well, he started writing them in 1933 when he published the magazine Kosmos in Danish for the first time. And in the first edition, the first Christmas edition, there's a very long Christmas letter with a lot of cosmic analyses. And after that, you can see that the Christmas letters in Kosmos every year were rather short for quite a while because he was very busy. He was writing Livets Bog, the Book of Life, and many other things. And he was also travelling around giving a lot of lectures in Denmark and Sweden, and later on in Iceland and India and Japan and so on. But around 1960, I think it was, he stopped lecturing in the provinces in Denmark. At that time he was 70 years old. And you can see at that point his Christmas letters got a bit longer. And he had an enormous amount of correspondence. But by writing these Christmas letters, he could sort of write to everybody at once. And you can see that he writes to people in Africa and Canada and the United States and India and many other places all at the one time. Yeah, not least Sweden. So there were a lot of people interested in his work at that time. So this was one way of keeping in touch with them. And one characteristic of these Christmas letters is that there's basically two sections in most of them. One is a kind of cosmic analysis, either about Christmas or about something he was writing about at the time. So we can see that some of them are not so directly related to Christmas. They were more related to what he was writing at the time. Although, in a sense, everything he's been writing has to do with Christmas. It's about the creation of Christmas all the year round. So he always manages to connect it to the whole idea of Christmas.
And then he also thanked his co-workers, didn't he? His associates.
Very much. The whole of Martinus's cause is very much based on voluntary help. There are very few people who are employed, very few employed staff at the Martinus Institute and the Martinus Centre. So nearly all the work that is done for the Martinus Institute is done on a voluntary level. And Martinus made a great point out of thanking everybody, because without everyone's help, then none of this work would be done. And he often said, yeah, thanks is such a small word for what he really felt. You know, he really felt this love and support, very practical support in the form of people helping with buildings and gardens and so on, and other kinds of support where people taught and gave lectures, ran study groups, and people translated his books, and people administered his cause, and people looked after the finances and so on. So he didn't leave anybody out. Everyone was thanked from the bottom of his heart for what they were doing for his work.
If you read one of the last Christmas letters that he wrote in the 70s, at the end of the 70s, I think he almost excuses himself for repeating himself all the time when he thanks his co-workers. And I know if you just have a look at one of them, because I sort of feel very moved when I read this, because we have Martinus as the great spiritual authority. And still I think, I mean, that's just my personal feeling, that he seems so humble and happy when he thanks them for all their work.
Yeah, it's very humble. It's very heartfelt. He doesn't take anybody or anything for granted. He regards everybody who's helping him as pioneers for this new world impulse, this Christ impulse that's coming over the earth at this point of rather a lot of darkness.
That must have been very inspiring to listen to. So I could just quote a few lines from a Christmas letter from 1949. He also, you can also sense that he has this connection to God, whatever he writes about. But here he focuses on thanking his co-workers. And this is what he writes, 1949. In tune with this divine nearness, it is my wish with this letter to extend my most sincere gratitude to all my friends for the faithfulness and love that you have shown in respect of my mission, my associates, and myself in the year that is now drawing to a close. The kind-heartedness in the form of warm greetings, understanding letters, and other manifestations of love that I have received from you have helped pave the stony road toward the light, and they have been immensely encouraging and inspiring for me in our great joint efforts in the service of light. It is in the continuation of this loving cooperation, proliferation and growth that I see this heavenly light being lit and nourished in the minds of the burdened and distressed terrestrial man. And I see God's command, "Let there be light," or love, becoming science, art, and beauty, and thus eternal peace and joy throughout the world. So I think that's very moving and extremely inspiring as well. Even so many years later on, I can sort of still feel almost that he speaks to us.
Yes. And at the beginning of that same Christmas letter, maybe I could just read a little of that, because here we have some cosmic analyses of what Christmas is about.
Exactly.
He says, "The time of darkness is upon us. We are passing the solstice and are in the midnight hour of the year's cycle, the domain of coldness and night. The sunlit days, the warmth and light of summer are gone. Nature has fallen silent, but through this lifeless stillness, across winter's white snowfields and ice-covered lakes, sounds and straits, a silvery moon is shining. It is glistening in the frost-covered trees and bushes, vying with the abundant radiance of Milky Ways and sun cities in sparkling with the light of thousands of stars in the dark, frosty night sky. Christmas is lending luster to the kingdom of the dead. God is present in the darkness. His presence overshadows everything.
That is an absolutely fantastic beginning. And he does what a poet usually does. He starts with a concrete image of nature surrounding us, and we can really feel that in Scandinavia. It is very, very dark, and it is very silent, and we see the beauty of it, but it is also lifeless in a way, so it's chilly. And then he starts with that and describes nature, and then he moves on and describes the light that we see in the darkness, and then telling us that it's Christmas is lending luster to the kingdom of the dead. And then he just goes on, God is present in the darkness. So then we are moving on to this spiritual presence where it's also a spiritual light. So I think it's quite fantastic.
Yes, and I think it's a great problem for people today. Is there a meaning? What's the meaning of life? I mean, why are we going through everything we are going through? We see so much darkness. We see all these refugees. We see so much suffering. We see great fires in America. The hospitals are filled up. People are lying in the corridors of the hospitals and so on. And people ask, is there any meaning to all of this? And of course, Martinus claims that there certainly is a meaning. And the ultimate meaning is, of course, it's a way of guaranteeing our eternal experience of life, that we have to experience darkness in order to experience light. And when we're satiated with light, we'll experience darkness again. So this principle of contrast is very basic to the experience of life. But as I say, we're so satiated with the experience of darkness now that we're longing for longer days, more sunshine, more warm hearts, and so on.
And so exactly as he gives us, he tells us that we should feel hope by just paying attention to the light and to the happiness that we can feel in the middle of the turning point, so to speak. Then, of course, his whole work serves as that kind of light to us in our lifetime, because, as you say, reading his works doesn't necessarily take away our suffering or other people's suffering, or that we worry about the situation in the world, but we see it in another perspective.
Yes, and maybe this world picture can give us 3 or 4 things. One is an understanding of the situation, which for me is very important. And then the courage and the strength and the inspiration to go through it, and without becoming pessimistic or unhappy. Of course, one can be unhappy temporarily, but if one has this basic feeling that everything makes sense, everything has some more profound meaning, then it's easier to go through it. Like if you're having a little operation, maybe the doctor has to cut something out, then of course it hurts, but you can go through it rather bravely if you know, once he's done that, it'll be over and everything will be better. So you can bravely go through the surgery or whatever it is.
So we should practice trying to have an eternal perspective and not just a local perspective.
Yes. I was just thinking that Martinus has a favourite expression that he apparently he used to say it a lot when he watched television with people. He watched the news, and he would say he could see very dark things in the news, and he'd say, well, this is how God models mankind's consciousness. And if you get this idea that there's this great artist, this great sculptor, who's sort of modeling your consciousness like it was a piece of clay to make it absolutely perfect. That's what's happening when we experience painful things. That there are unfinished sides of ourselves that are being sort of smoothed and made perfect.
Exactly. And when you do read perhaps several of his Christmas letters or articles, you might even be surprised to see, if you do it for the first time, to see that he quite often mentions negative and distressing things like war and suffering and natural catastrophes and so on. I mean, you can find a lot of references to those things in his letters. Even the first one that you mentioned in the beginning from 1933. I've only got it in Danish, so I'm not going to translate it. But he really starts by talking about traditions becoming old-fashioned or sort of going down the drain. He talks about that everything is in transformation, and this is 1933, that parliaments are overthrown, that dictatorships are rising all over the world, that religious problems are being discussed. And it's so interesting because I feel that we can recognize so much of that today, in 2018, that we feel that if you wouldn't have this eternal perspective, you might very well feel that everything is going in the wrong direction, at least from a democratic perspective. What do you think?
Well, absolutely. And it is something he comes back to all the time, because the great problem for people is the understanding of darkness.
Exactly. And the important thing is, when he has talked about this suffering, I think with a great deal of empathy as well for us.
Yeah.
That we are in the middle of suffering, that many people suffer also from different consequences of the pole transformation, of the sexual pole transformation that we had talked about earlier. So there is individual suffering, but also huge global crises. But then he always says, and then we have this light, or then we have this voice, as he says in that 1933 letter. Then we have an echo of a song from Palestine. A savior has been born. So he always comes back to the light after having commented on the dark.
Yes. And actually this savior that's being born is an organic process that's happening within ourselves. The Christmas Gospel tells us about the virgin birth. And of course, biologically, you could say, well, that's impossible, and Joseph was the father of Jesus and so on. But what Martinus is talking about is, well, he says it's a symbol of the birth of another aspect of our own consciousness. And that is this opposite pole, this opposite sexual pole in our consciousness, which we have dealt with in other podcasts, so I won't go into detail with it today. But in order to love our neighbour as ourselves, everybody, totally impartially, we need to have the masculine and feminine principles in balance in our consciousness. This is a kind of cosmic birth in our consciousness. It's the birth of the Christ child, this all-loving child in our consciousness. So as long as we're totally one-poled, in other words, 100% male or 100% female, we're not capable of loving our neighbour as ourselves. We love at most one person of the opposite sex and are partial towards them at the expense of others. So he talks about a totally new mentality, a Christmas mentality, if you like, but it's an enormous cosmic principle, and it's the birth of an organic. It's the start of an organic process within ourselves, and that's really happening at the moment. And yeah, you see a lot of manifestations of it practically at Christmas here, where are the children going to spend Christmas? One day with their father, one day with their mother, because of divorces and so on. So,
yeah, exactly. And of course, he also gives us some concrete advice what we could do. Of course, rejoice in this Christmas spirit. He actually tells us, and that's in an article that's called The Christmas Star, and I think it's from 1941, which means that it is in the middle of the Second World War, and Denmark was even occupied by the Germans. So it must have been a very, very difficult and scary time to live in. And then he tells his readers that they shouldn't be too grown up to celebrate Christmas. I think that's quite nice. He says the individual human beings should be careful about being so highly evolved that they feel too grown up to celebrate Christmas. And then he says it's not thinking so much about the outer form of Christmas, but he thinks about its inner truth. Because exactly as you said, being reminded of the existence of one's fellow beings is of tremendous value, so that one can think lovingly of them. So he really, really stresses that in the middle of war, and I'm just thinking of our present time as well. Earlier in the article he says, there is nothing that I would rather abolish with a few words today than war, but I cannot do so. And if I did have the power to do so, such an act would in itself express the highest degree of unkindness to people, for it would mean that the evolution towards beautiful states, which we are now experiencing, would be stopped. So, I mean, he stresses that, and in the middle of war, what people should do is actually, and I don't know if that was frustrating at the time, because certainly you must have felt in Denmark in 1941 that there was a clear outer enemy. And he actually tells people you should work with yourselves.
Yeah.
But I think that it must have been very uplifting at the same time, because it could give them some distance to what was happening in the outside world. And the same thing might be for us.
Yes. Maybe I could read a little from another Christmas letter. This one is from 1949. He starts by saying, "Light in the darkness is a proper term for Christmas. We see, too, how Christmas is celebrated by lighting millions of candles and switching on millions of lights. In the streets, in the shop windows, in the homes, everywhere lights are switched on, lights that shine out in the darkness of winter. The children's eyes vie with all the Christmas lights in shining at the thought of Christmas trees and Christmas presents. Most adults, too, are influenced by the Christmas atmosphere, despite their troubles and the pressure of their work. Many of these adults, however, think absolutely that Christmas is exclusively a feast for children, and that they themselves have grown out of that kind of childish delight." Yeah, this is what you were saying later, so it seems to be a theme he comes back to, that Christmas is not so childish. I'll go on. "Nonetheless, all the lights in the darkness influence their mentality, and in their heart of hearts, they would be reluctant to miss the Christmas celebrations, which evoke memories of their own childhood's Christmas parties and Christmas delights. When we celebrate Christmas, we celebrate the birth of a child that grew up and became a shining and radiant example for people. He became an example of what it really means to be a human being, particularly in situations where he met people's scorn and derision, their hatred and persecution. He showed that one can meet all the so-called evil that we perceive as mental darkness with the light of one's consciousness, instead of retorting with new hatred or scorn. He became a shining light in the mental winter zone of darkness. But Christmas is not merely a celebration in memory of a child that was born in Bethlehem, and it will not, as some irreligious people think, gradually become something that will be dropped because people will grow out of that kind of naivety and superstition. On the contrary, Christmas is a manifestation of something that will increasingly make its influence felt in the human psyche, because it is a product of the creative principle that has transformed the earth from a glowing mass of fire into its present beautiful sunlit world where intellectual human beings can live. The principle of Christmas, light in the darkness, is in itself something that cannot be stopped. Attempting to wipe out the basic principle of the Christmas atmosphere in the human being would be the same as trying to switch off the sun.
I think that's fantastic. And as you said, extremely inspiring and also important perhaps to remember today when, as you mentioned at the beginning, it's even if people give each other presents, it's also a lot about consumerism and buying and so on, so that we really, really remember the inner meaning of this, the spiritual meaning of Christmas.
Yes, maybe I could just take a few more lines from this letter that deals with that. It's a bit later on in the letter. He says, "The joy of Christmas will become joy in living. Christmas presents will become the human being giving himself. That is, his joy in living and his creative ability for the benefit of the whole. And the peace of Christmas will become peace all the year round, not merely between the different nations, but also between different human beings. There will really be peace on earth and goodwill to all men, as is promised in the Christmas Gospel. But in order really to understand what the meaning of this old message is, One must become acquainted with it, as it was preached to the wise and not merely to the simple-minded, as has been the case during the old world impulse. The human being must learn to understand the speech of the universe about the Christmas message. So the best present we can give is ourselves in our own behavior.
And that's of course what he did as well. Martinus mentions the lights, the sort of mental lights that God has given to us throughout history, like, as you said, the great religious world redeemers. He mentions Buddha and Jesus and Muhammad and others. But I mean, of course, he is one of them as well. I mean, he really lightens up our path through these words that we can use.
Yes. Actually, in one of the other Christmas letters, he mentions a whole long list of people. Beings such as Rama, Krishna, Hermes, Moses, Orpheus, Pythagoras, Plato, Confucius, Buddha, Muhammad, Christ, and many others are shining stars on terrestrial man's mental night sky of the killing principle. Through them shines the light of the sunny regions of neighbourly love and peace to a greater or lesser extent. They represent God's nearness in the spiral cycle's terrestrial winter sphere or region of death. They are the shining sun city or star world of this sphere of night. Every zone of darkness, every night sky has its shining sun city or star world, and thus its light and view of the wide expanses, the universe, light and warmth, love and the Holy Father. This view and this light in the darkness are the eternal good tidings of Christmas, the eternal ideal, the eternal model for the shaping of our own existence, manifested by the Godhead himself through the speech of the universe. Yeah, so that he lists quite a cast of people who have helped us through many epochs: Rama, Krishna, Hermes, Moses, Orpheus, Pythagoras, and so on, which I find quite interesting.
It's interesting and it's beautiful, and as you say, he actually often recurs to the same topics or the same main thoughts in all those letters, it seems to me.
Yes.
But I think we could talk about this forever, but people are busy before Christmas. I also actually get quite moved by reading them. So we'd better stop and going back to what we have to do before Christmas. But I could hope that everyone would have a few free days where you can actually read and reflect on those things and also just enjoy the happy spirit of Christmas like it tells us to do, and don't feel too grown up to do it.
Yes.
But if anyone would like to read those letters, that might be important to tell before we stop. If anyone would like to read this, where could they find them?
They're in, they're not all translated into English because there are an awful lot of them. But you can find some of Martinus' Christmas articles and some of his Christmas letters on the Martinus Institute's homepage, martinus.dk. If you go into the English section and go under the section that's into the section called Martinus Writings, then go into articles, you'll find some of them there. Otherwise, you'll find them in old editions of the English Kosmos, English edition of the magazine Kosmos.
Yes. So I'll certainly hope then that you, Mary, will have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. I know you always have your annual New Year's course at the Martinus Centre in Clint, don't you?
Yes, I'm going up to Clint. We have a New Year's course from the 28th until the 1st of January. It always sells out before we even advertise it, so it's very popular. So I look forward to some days of concentrating on Martinus' cosmic analysis and being together with people. And the centre will be completely full. So we look forward to having a nice time together.
I'm sure you will. And I know it's very dark outside at the Martinus Centre Clint in winter, but I'm sure you will have all the more light inside.
And Merry Christmas to you, Pernilla, and thank you for our cooperation in 2018. Yeah, we look forward to doing more podcasts together and with other people in 2019. Thank you for listening. And I must say, personally, I'm very touched by mails I have received from people from China, from Holland, from Belgium, from America, from the UK, and various places of people that listen to us around the world. So that's very gratifying for us, sitting in our apartments here in the cold north of Scandinavia, that people are listening to us in far-flung parts of the world. It's a truly universal message. So, and we see that when I see some of the reactions to our podcasts.
And of course, we wish everyone, really everyone on earth, a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. And we will just remember Martinus's words that Christmas is the feast of love and that God is present in the darkness. His presence overshadows everything. Goodbye from Stockholm.
And goodbye from Copenhagen.